Hi everybody, I'm Ryan, and over the course of the past few months, we have talked about basically every standard deck. We've talked about a bunch of different things regarding those decks, but specifically, we've talked tips and tricks that you need to know if you're playing or playing against these standard decks. So I wanted to compile them all into one video, one comprehensive tips and tricks for every standard deck. Enjoy. I just want to explain why bouncing is good in this deck. So the overall idea of the deck is that you have a bunch of very, very cheap permanents, whether it be enchantments or creatures, that do something when they enter the battlefield. And then generally, most of the time, just sit there after they enter the battlefield. And then you also have these cards that are not very powerful because the downside of the card is they have to return one of your things to your hand, like Fear of Isolation or This Town Ain't Big Enough. But if you can build your deck so that is not a downside, you return these permanents that you want to return to your hand so you can replay because you basically only want the end of the battlefield effect, then you have a deck. That's what this deck is trying to do. And that's why bouncing is very, very good. You turn a weakness of these pretty powerful cards into a strength. Now, speaking of This Town Ain't Big Enough, it's a 5 mana instant that says it costs 3 less if it targets a permanent you control. It says return 2 target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. Now, very often when we think of This Town Ain't Big Enough, we think of the Esper deck tapping 5 mana, returning 2 things so they can like jam for lethal or something, or more often returning 1 thing of the Esper deck's 1 thing of their opponents. But remember, This Town Ain't Big Enough can return 2 of the Esper deck's own permanents to their hand, which very often is the most powerful play because, again, your deck is built to play this stuff and capitalize on those enter the battlefield effects. Also remember Stormchaser's Challenge. It takes a lot of mana, so it's really only good in matchups that like go really long. But remember, level 2 of Stormchaser's Challenge can grab This Town Ain't Big Enough from the graveyard, and then you can cast This Town Ain't Big Enough to return Stormchaser's Challenge to kind of reset, get another otter, level up Stormchaser's Challenge to grab This Town Ain't Big Enough, and then you can repeat that. Again, it costs a lot of mana, but This Town Ain't Big Enough can return Stormchaser's Challenge and something else, so you can get a lot of value just from like kind of doing that cycle and applying pressure with the otters. So Valiant triggers when you target a creature with Valiant for the first time each turn. There are 2 Valiant cards we play in this deck. It's Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. Both of them do very powerful things. We talk about it in the deck tech, but understand that abilities trigger Valiant as well. That includes Manifold Mouse triggering every single turn. The Manifold Mouse giving double strike triggers Valiant on both Emberheart Challenger and Heartfire Hero, and activating Rockface Village as a land will trigger Valiant on Emberheart Challenger and Heartfire Hero. You don't need a spell to trigger Valiant. You can do it with abilities, and not devoting a card to it makes it even more powerful. Also remember, Screaming Nemesis will deal damage to the opponent even with your own spells. So if you're going to Burst Lightning for damage for your opponent and you have a Screaming Nemesis, you might as well Burst Lightning the Screaming Nemesis and then redirect the damage to your opponent, because then they won't gain life for the rest of the game. And then also, if you're playing Witchstalker Frenzy, which if you're playing Mono Red, you are playing Witchstalker Frenzy, even though Witchstalker Frenzy can't target the opponent, you can target your own Screaming Nemesis, which will kill the Screaming Nemesis, but you can redirect that 5 damage to the opponent. And 5 damage to the face for sometimes 1 mana is insane. We're going to start with simple and then get a little bit harder. One of the simple nuances is leave Fairy Mastermind up and have access to Fairy Mastermind against decks that draw cards. Fairy Mastermind isn't a great card if it's not drawing cards for you, either with Enduring Curiosity or literally off of your opponent's draws, and being able to surprise them can win you games, whether it's the mirror match or against the Up the Beanstalk decks. That being said, the multiple Fairy Masterminds trigger multiple times. And so if you have 2 Fairy Masterminds, your opponent draws their second card for their turn, you can draw 2 cards. And what may be less obvious is if you activate Fairy Mastermind, it makes you both draw a card. But if that's the second card your opponent has drawn, now you have 2 triggers. So you have drawn 3 cards, your opponent has only drawn 1 off of 1 Fairy Mastermind activation if you have multiple, and obviously there's more if you have more. Something to remember, though, is if you happen to have an insane amount of mana, Fairy Mastermind isn't for extra cards drawn. Fairy Mastermind literally only cares about the second card drawn of your opponents. So multiple activations effectively do nothing other than help you dig, but also lets your opponent draw cards too. When you ninjutsu Kaido onto the battlefield, doing it on things that have enter the battlefield effects is the best way to go about it. Because you can put that thing with enter the battlefield effects back in your hand and get that enter the battlefield effect again. So whether it be Tishana's Tidebinder, so you can counter another activated ability, Flood Pit's Drowner for be able to tap something down, Spyglass Siren, all that stuff. You don't always have to do things with end of battlefield effects, but things with end of battlefield effects is almost always better because it just gets you more value. And then the last like tiny nuance that's important is surprising your opponent with flash cards is a really important aspect of this deck. Now, whether it be flashing in a Fairy Mastermind on end step, untapping, attacking, and then casting Enduring Curiosity, or just making an attack and seeing if they block, and if they don't, flashing an Enduring Curiosity, making them surprised all the time is super important, especially since this deck has a uncanny ability to put a bunch of power onto the battlefield at the beginning of your opponent's end step, tap down some creatures, remove some creatures, untap, play Enduring Curiosity, and draw a ton of cards. It's just disgusting. It's so good, but you have to make sure you're doing that. First off, Valiant is not heroic. Valiant triggers on abilities, which means Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger can trigger every single turn if you have Manifold Mouse on the battlefield, and every single turn with a little bit of help if you activate Rockface Village on those creatures, which means you can draw an extra card every single, no, I guess not draw, but effectively draw an extra card every single turn on Emberheart Challenger, and put a +1/+1 counter on Heartfire Hero pretty much every turn. It also works with Innkeeper's Talon, which is so good. Remember that oftentimes it makes sense, especially if you have like a large Heartfire Hero and you have 2 Manifold Mouse, it makes sense to trample and double strike the same creature. But also it's important to do the math because sometimes you want your Heartfire Hero to die in combat, and giving that double strike wouldn't necessarily do that. And so it's really difficult, and it's important to do that combat math. If you plan on Burst Lightning your opponent for damage, you might as well Burst Lightning your Screaming Nemesis, because then it makes them not gain life for the rest of the game, which is really good for your aggro deck. But also remember, cards like Scorching Shot that are meant to get rid of opponent's creatures can also just be used on your own Screaming Nemesis to deal 5 direct damage to your opponent for 2 mana, which is very good and can often finish the game. I don't talk a lot about bluffing on this channel, but when you have a deck that famously has cards like Snakeskin Veil in their deck, leaving a green up for what seems like no reason can scare your opponent into thinking you have Snakeskin Veil, and can cause them to play in suboptimal ways to play around Snakeskin Veil even if you don't have it. And so that's important to remember as well. First off, Overlord of the Hauntwoods gives you domain, right? The Everywhere token is one of each basic land type, which means that with a single Everywhere, Leyline Binding costs 1. Period. That's really important to remember. Also, with a single Everywhere, you get 5 beast tokens. With Herd Migration, you know, everything that might have to do with domain, you get with 1 Overlord of the Huntwoods trigger. Second off, and the big reason you're playing this deck in the first place, so I hope you already know this, but it's important to mention, is that Zur combos with the Overlords incredibly well. If you activate Zur on an impended Overlord and then attack with it, you still get the attack trigger. You don't have to wait for the thing to be unimpended. Yeah, by it being impended, it doesn't remove the text on the card. That is a creature enchantment that is attacking. It also gives us this Death Touch, Hexproof, Lifelink, you know, the things that Zur normally gives an enchantment it activates on. And speaking of those Zur activations, if your opponent is attempting to remove one of your enchantments, whether it be an impended Overlord or a Leyline Binding or Up the Beanstalk, you can activate Zur on it to give it Hexproof in response and have that spot removal for your enchantment fizzle. And also remember that Up the Beanstalk doesn't care if a cost is reduced for it being mana cost 5 or greater. So your Overlords being impended will still trigger Up the Beanstalk, and you casting Leyline Binding for 1 mana is still going to trigger Up the Beanstalk. It's kind of what makes the deck very good. The first nuance is if you should play Monster Dread Knight as a creature or keep it in your hand. And the big decision maker for that is if your hand is already strong, the pressure you get from a 3/2 on turn 2 is normally better than just like trying to make your hand a little bit better. But if you've mulliganed or your hand's kind of weak, then it is correct to play the Dread Whisper side and draw a card. But do not be afraid to play it as a 3/2 and apply that pressure if your hand's very good already. The next nuance is surrounding Glissa. Glissa has a mode that is often overlooked, and that's removing counters from something. Remember that removing counters from a Planeswalker can often kill a Planeswalker, and if you remove counters from Archfiend to the Dross, it can win you the game. People forget about that, so if you have a Glissa and your opponent has an Archfiend to the Dross, you attack and they have to chump block with their Archfiend or they lose, which is kind of a hilarious interaction. And then something else, remember Unholy Annex drains your opponent if you control a demon. Remember, Soulstone Sanctuary is a demon, and so manning up that man land has a Mutavault effect where it's every creature type, which includes demon, which lets you drain. First off, the core of the deck, and this is important to know, is bouncing your own things that have awesome enter the battlefield effects. So using things like This Town Ain't Big Enough or Fear of Isolation, I think that's what the card is called. Hey, good for me, I know card names. Bouncing things that have enter the battlefield effects, either tapping things down in Flood Pit's Drowner, killing things with nowhere to run, making your opponent discard and lose life with Hopeless Nightmare, etc., and then just getting a ton of value off of that. That's the core of the deck. However, it's important not to get tunnel visioned on bouncing your own things. Remember, This Town Ain't Big Enough, you can pay 5 mana and just bounce 2 of your opponent's things. I've won plenty of games where you just like have a bunch of creatures, your opponent have blockers, and you just go 5 mana, get rid of your blockers, kill you. It happens all the time. So don't get tunnel visioned on needing to bounce your own thing with This Town Ain't Big Enough. Remember, you can pay 5 mana and just get stuff out of the way. And then lastly, there's a pretty mana intensive but important to know loop with Stormchaser's Talent and This Town Ain't Big Enough. So if you play Stormchaser's Talent, you get an otter. Maybe you've played a This Town Ain't Big Enough, or you use This Town Ain't Big Enough for value, so it's in your graveyard. You can level up Stormchaser's Talent with 4 mana to get This Town Ain't Big Enough back to your hand. And then you can pay 2 mana to bounce Stormchaser's Talent and something else, either your opponent's thing or your own thing or whatever, to return that to your hand. Replay Stormchaser's Talent for 1 mana, get another otter. Then you can level up Stormchaser's Talent to get that This Town Ain't Big Enough from the graveyard, etc., it loops. This loop is really important to know in these very, very long games, because like massing otters and just having a ton of prowess triggers and stuff like that is really how you nickel and dime and win those super, super long games. So that's important to know. And frankly, this blue-white control deck is pretty straightforward as far as a blue-white control deck goes. One, it's important to understand how Fountain Port exactly works, though. So Fountain Port is a colorless land. We can tap it to add a colorless mana. We can pay 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice a token and draw a card. We can pay 3 mana and tap it to pay 1 life, create a 1/1 bluefish creature token. And we can pay 4 mana and tap it to create a treasure token. So really, this is a mana dump for us. And it's really cute being able to sacrifice like Beza tokens and stuff like that, or like map tokens from Lester's Anchorage to draw cards, and that's super, super good. However, the way we're going to be using this most of the time is comboing it with itself. If we have an untapped Fountain Point and 3 more mana at the end of our opponent's turn, you know, if we didn't counterspell something or it's deep in the late game or whatever, we can just make a fish. We can then apply pressure with that fish, and then when we want to, sacrifice it and draw a card. And so it allows us to benefit from having so many lands and have the games go super, super long, because we can just bury our opponent in pressure and card draw. Second off, the biggest reason we're playing Jace is for card advantage, but also it's a win condition. We don't need to be using the Overlord and Beza and Hornlock Whale and stuff like that. Jace is a 4-mana planeswalker that is completed. One of the blue is Phyrexian mana, so we can pay 2 life rather than blue if we want to. If we do that, it enters with 2 less loyalty. Its +1 is until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3, -0. That most of the time doesn't really do anything. Is -2 is target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. It's -X as target player mills 3 times X cards. So the first Jace that we play on a clear board, normally we're just gonna be like, hey, my opponent mill 3 cards, I'm gonna draw a card, and it's that card advantage. You kind of have to answer it, because once every few turns, I'm going to draw cards off of it. If I activate it too many times and the game goes too long, I get to draw 3 cards out of it, and then the game's just over. But after a few Jace activations, the game goes a little long, maybe our opponent draws some cards, whatever. We eventually get to a point where you can just pay 4 mana for Jace, say -5, mill 15, and then just like you're so far ahead, and that's like the clock we put on our opponent, rather than having to put a clock on the board, like with creatures. And then the last kind of thing is we're playing Obstinate Baloth and Wiltly Fleege for the for discard effects like Hopeless Nightmare. Wiltly Fleege has other modes. One, we can actually cast it as opposed to Obstinate Baloth, but also it pumps up Beza, it pumps up Overlord and the insects it creates. And so it can very much be lethal, you know, when we play it, pump everything up, make blockers much, 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 much bigger. And if we have multiple Wiltly Fleeges on the battlefield, they pump each other up twice, so they're both 6/6s, which is just disgusting. First off, remember that Novice Inspector makes a clue token, and that clue token does not require tapping it to activate it, which means you can use the clue to activate Warden of the Inner Skies ability, and then still be able to crack the clue to draw a card. That being said, remember, if you plan on cracking the clue to draw a card and you have a Warden of the Inner Skies, if it's possible, make sure you tap it to activate Warden before you crack it. Often, Jeskai Convoke players can get a little tunnel visioned off of Gleeful Demolition, really only treating it as a destroy your own artifact and get 3 1/1s. But remember, you can target your opponent's artifacts as well, and they don't even get the 1/1s. So it's main deck artifact hate. I don't know in what matchups that would be totally relevant, but it's important to remember. And then lastly, remember you're playing blue for counter magic. And the biggest reason you're playing blue for counter magic is to make sure you don't get wiped. This deck has a little bit of staying power, but not as much as other aggro decks, to be totally honest, because the deck's kind of comboing with itself. And so assuming you already have a decent board state and you have the option of advancing your board or leaving Protect the Negotiators up against a deck that you know has board wipes, just leave the Protect the Negotiators up, apply that pressure, make sure you don't get wiped and lose the game. Like, I've seen so many people just get greedy, tap out for no reason, just to advance their board and then die. And that's awful, so don't do that. So to reiterate the combo, you're trying to put Omniscience in the graveyard with all of these awesome instants and sorceries. Reanimate it with Abdullah's Awakening, so you have an Omniscience on the battlefield, except it's a 1/1 spirit in addition to its other types, and then use that Omniscience to cast all these dig spells for free to eventually hit an Invasion of Archaeavos, to eventually hit an Invasion of Archaeavos, to eventually hit an Invasion of Arcavios, which I have no clue if I'm pronouncing right. That was my 3rd attempt at that line. To grab a Season of Weaving from the graveyard, to return everything to your hand, copy the Omniscience, but now there's a 1/1 Spirit Omniscience token on the battlefield, so it does not return with Season of Weaving. And then you can replay all of these things, notably Invasion of Archaeavos to grab Season of Weaving again, return everything again, make another 1/1 token, and then you make infinite 1/1 Omniscience tokens. And then at the end of the combo, and here's where an important tip and trick is, once you have enough to kill your opponent the following turn, it's really important to grab things from your graveyard that can interrupt that. So notably, that's like normally negates, like grabbing multiple negates from your sideboard. I think I said graveyard, I mean sideboard. So it doesn't matter what your opponent does the following turn, you can just like negate it and then it's just over. Because remember, you get to cast it for free with Omniscience. Another interesting tip and trick with this is that Invasion can grab Abdullah's Awakening to start the combo, which is kind of interesting. Unfortunately, that means you need a different Invasion to grab the Season of Weaving from your sideboard. But, I mean, having an Omniscience on the battlefield can never be, like, bad, right? Invasion, grab Abdullah's Awakening, Abdullah's Awakening, your Omniscience, and then you can play all of these dig spells for free, so it's pretty easy to get the Invasion of Arcavios. Hey, I said it right that time. To then actually start the combo. First off is remember that pretty much every permanent you have besides enchantments can be tapped for Warden. That includes vehicles, that includes the clue and map tokens, that includes everything. So if you have a Warden on the battlefield, unless you really need to block, make sure that during the second main phase, after you've attacked, tap the stuff for Warden. Or if you are going to attack with Warden, tap things that are summoning sick before you attack, because you can tap them for Warden even if they're summoning sick, because it's an extremely powerful card the bigger that you make it. And then the other big nuance that's important to know is comboing with Bunnicorn. So Regal Bunnicorn is often absolutely huge. And if you can play a Steel Seraph and give it Vigilance, it becomes very difficult to block. If you give it Flying, literally can't block it. And if you give it Lifelink, it's a way for you to keep up with the aggro decks. In addition to that, if you happen to be playing the Ajani Color of the Applied version, that can just be kind of a combo kill, where you play a big Regal Bunnicorn, play Ajani, jump it to give it Flying and Double Strike, and very often you can defeat them in just one turn, which is pretty sweet. And the first one, I feel like is obvious, but this feels like a red-green aggro deck, but remember, Delirium matters. Pay attention when you discard stuff. Sometimes you're going to be discarding things that aren't like the weakest card in your hand just to get Delirium in the graveyard, and that's okay. And pay attention to what you pick when you mill off of things like Seed of Hope or Dredger's Insight, because you don't want to take Delirium from yourself, even if it means not grabbing the most powerful card that you milled. And alongside that, remember, there's a lot of things that are multiple types, like Patchwork Beastie and Wildfire Wickerfolk are artifact creatures. That counts as 2 types as far as Delirium goes. Or Fear of Missing Out is an enchantment creature, again, counting as 2 separate types. So those cards being in the graveyard are even more powerful. Also, if you plan on playing the Afterburner Expert Dragonautics Engineer combo, Afterburner Expert being in the graveyard is excellent because whenever we activate an exhaust ability, which is very easy with Dragonautics Engineer or with another Afterburner Expert, we get to bring Afterburner Expert back for free, and then it becomes really difficult to answer if they don't have exile or removal. And then lastly, Keen-Eyed Curator is one of our best threats, but pay attention to what you exile. This is good in this deck because there are so many card types in this deck that we can exile stuff in our graveyard with Keen-Eyed Curator and of course our opponent's graveyard. But sometimes we're going to take Delirium away from ourselves to make this thing a 7/7. And sometimes that's okay, but you need to be smart about it and understand your role in the matchup and the situation as a whole. First off, it's important to understand the engine of the deck. This isn't a 1-for-1 control deck and then there's one big payoff that lets you catch up on cards or whatever. You're trying to outcard your opponent. That is the name of the game of this deck. And the way you do that is by playing Caretaker's Talent and or Enduring Innocence, and then making tokens with things like Caracate, Fountain Port, and Beza, and then use those enter the battlefield effects to draw cards. And then you use the insane amount of cards that you draw to just pull way ahead in the game. You need to do that in your games or you will lose your games. That is really important to understand, and you need to keep hands that do this. However, this brings me to my next nuance, is that if you level up Caretaker's Talent all the way and give tokens +2/+2, those tokens will no longer trigger Enduring Innocence because they will be too big to trigger Enduring Innocence. I actually saw this recently at Narcy and it was a little devastating for the person. Next up, Sunfall does technically make a token. However, it does not enter as a creature, so it does trigger Caretaker's Talent, but does not trigger Enduring Innocence. And then if you sideboard in Rest in Peace and you have Rest in Peace, make sure your Enduring Innocence doesn't die because it will not come back because the Enduring cards touch the graveyard and will get exiled when it hits the graveyard if Rest in Peace is on the battlefield. So the first play pattern is, remember that Mabel creates an equipment, and equipping targets, which we know from Nadu and Modern, but targeting of an ability triggers Valiant. So remember that equipping the equipment triggers the Valiant on Emberheart Challenger and Heartfire Hero and the white one drop I forgot the name of and that kind of stuff. Also remember the insane mouse synergies, alongside Valiant. If we have Manifold Mouse, every single turn Manifold Mouse triggers and targets Emberheart Challenger or Heartfire Hero or that white one drop that's right here wherever I put the picture that I forgot the name of. It will trigger Valiant on that card in addition to giving it Double Strike. Most of the time you're giving it Double Strike or Trample. It's an amazing mouse synergy, and that's really the biggest reason why we're playing this. We're also playing Rockface Village, which even though it's a land ability, we get to trigger Valiant every single turn with that if we want to as well. And knowing these synergies is really, really important whether you're playing or playing against the deck. And then a very classic strong because Screaming Nemesis is a newer card, but a pretty known synergy is Screaming Nemesis exists in this deck between the main deck and the sideboard, even though it's not a mouse. And it very often against decks that are looking to gain life, they can burst lightning their own Screaming Nemesis, deal the 2 damage to their opponent so they can't gain life for the rest of the game. But an even better and maybe less known way to do this is if you jam with a whole bunch, you can actually deal damage and then Witchstalker Frenzy your own Screaming Nemesis. And even though Witchstalker Frenzy can't deal damage to face, Screaming Nemesis is dealt 5 damage, so it can deal that 5 damage to face very often for 1 mana off of Witchstalker Frenzy. The first kind of weird, cool nuance is the Surveil, either Haughtygen or preferably Aberonoculus into the graveyard on turn 1. Untap and then reanimated it on turn 2, that is your nut hand. It's unlikely. We have a lot of Surveil lands, but it's unlikely. But being aware of it is important, knowing to put those cards into the graveyard if you have the reanimate spell in your hand. Or sometimes it's correct to do that anyway. That's what the deck's trying to do overall. Next up is how to play Founding of the Third Path in your deck. And generally, you don't want to read ahead with this card. Normally, you just want to start on chapter 1, cast something like Chart a Course or whatever from your hand with Founding of the Third Path, mill yourself the 4 cards, because remember, we want instants and sorceries and those creatures and all that stuff in our graveyard, and then do the third one where we exile target instant sorcery card from a graveyard, copy it, you may cast the copy. Now, understand that you don't get to cast it for free. You actually have to pay the mana on the copy in the 3rd chapter. That's very important to remember. And the situations where you might want to read ahead is if you really need a creature and have a reanimation in your hand and have the mana, you might want to read ahead to chapter 2, see if you can mill a creature so you can reanimate it. And then the only time you would want to read ahead to chapter 3 is if you're so far ahead you don't need the value and an insert or sorcery card in your graveyard would seal up the game. Because remember, when you read ahead, you're kind of hemorrhaging that value. Next up is we have situations where we exile cards from our graveyard. Namely, Aberranoculus is the big one. We have to exile cards from our graveyard to cast it from our hand. When you do that, make sure you're exiling all the non-instants and sorceries in your graveyard and the non-Aberranoculuses in your graveyard first. Because we want instants and sorceries in our graveyard so our Haughtygen's very, very big, and we want Aberranoculuses in our graveyard, and actually sometimes Haughtygen in our graveyard, so that we can reanimate them and cheat them on the battlefield. So I know it feels obvious, but I've seen people mess it up. Just do the lands first, do the creatures first, even if you don't have a Haughtygen on the battlefield already. First off, Gleeful Demolition is a part of our combo, right? Being able to Gleeful Demolition our own artifacts is absolutely great, but remember, you can also use it as artifact hate for our opponents. Now, there aren't a lot of hyper powerful artifacts in Standard at the moment, but it's a very, very relevant mode of the card. Remember, clue tokens don't have tapping as a part of the cost. So we can actually tap our clue token to Warden and then still draw a card off of that clue token if we have enough mana. Can't do that with blood tokens or maps or whatever, but we can with clues. And then lastly, and the last like important thing that you need to know about this deck is that you can tap your creatures without combat, which makes Split Up really, really powerful. If we're in kind of like a stare down situation where you both have a bunch of creatures and they're all untapped and it's kind of just waiting for our opponent to do their thing, we can tap our creatures with Knight Errant of Eos and Warden and then cast Split Up and say untapped to have a one-sided board wipe without having to kind of like kill our creatures by attacking into a bunch of creatures that they can like block really well with. Now, I want to quickly re-explain how the deck works. Basically, you're filling your graveyard with permanents. Nearly every single card, especially in your main deck, are permanents. And then you're casting a bunch of cards for very low mana, sometimes 1 mana, because they have this effect that reduces cost depending on how many permanents or how many creatures are in the graveyard. And then there's an additional combo. Understand that Up the Beanstalk doesn't care what mana you actually use to cast the spell. It cares about its mana cost. So if something's 6 mana, but its cost has been reduced to 1 mana, it still sees it as 6 mana. So you still draw a card off of that thing that that you cast for cheap. That's really important to know, and why Up the Beanstalk is played in this deck at all. But really, the only other nuance of this deck, other than filling your graveyard as fast as possible and like making sure you get your Up the Beanstalk triggers for even though you're reducing costs of stuff, is 9 Vermin. 9 Vermin says when it dies, it gives -1/-1 to target creature. We can force that, especially against the aggro decks. So Souls of the Lost is already very good against the aggro decks. It's a really big thing to attack through in this deck. And when we cast Souls of the Lost, we can sack 9 Vermin to actually kill a creature of our opponents. And then we have a big old blocker in Souls of the Lost, and we cash in on 9 Vermin, because really we're only playing 9 Vermin to mill cards and put more permanents into our graveyard so we can cast those really, really big creatures later on in the game. But if we sacrifice 9 Vermin, it kills a mono red creature, and we have that big blocker in Souls of the Lost, which is so, so powerful. First off are the bounce synergies. Now, there's less bounce synergies as the blue version of the deck, because they have things like This Town Ain't Big Enough, but we still have Nurturing Pixie. Nurturing Pixie is a 1-mana 1/1 with flying. When Nurturing Pixie enters, return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand. If a permanent was returned this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nurturing Pixie. So this was written on this card pretty much as a downside to playing Nurturing Pixie and having this essentially 2-power flyer as a 1-drop. However, we're capitalizing on it. We have these cards like Grim Bauble, that when it enters, it gives -2/-2 to something. Hopeless Nightmare and Tiny Bones, which makes our opponent discard. Momentum Breaker, which edicts. Nowhere to Run, which gives -3/-3. Lauren, which destroys artifacts and enchantments. Ritual Chamber, which we can reset. Et cetera, et cetera. All these things that we want to return to our hand so we can replay, which makes Nurturing Pixie an incredible synergy and probably the best card in our deck. My favorite synergy with this deck is with Temporary Lockdown. So Temporary Lockdown is a 3-mana enchantment. When it enters, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until Temporary Lockdown leaves the battlefield. So this is, mostly for aggro decks, and it's like just generally very good. However, if we play Temporary Lockdown in turn 5 or 6 or something like that, and put some Hopeless Nightmare underneath it, some Grim Baubles underneath it, even maybe Nurturing Pixie underneath it, maybe some Momentum Breakers, some Nowhere to Run, whatever underneath it. And then we either play Lauren to kill Temporary Lockdown, get Lost to kill Temporary Lockdown, or return Temporary Lockdown to our hand with Nurturing Pixie. All that stuff re-enters and we re-get the Enter the Battlefield effects, just like if we bounced with Nurturing Pixie, which means all that stuff happens again. They discard a bunch of cards, things get -2/-2, or they edict. Like, it's so cool and good. And you get to choose what order they enter the stack. So, like, you can kill something with Grim Bauble and then edict something with a Momentum Breaker, or whatever. It's super good. Another really fun synergy is one of the flex slots that you can play in this deck is Shieldred. And Lord of the Third Path has a really cool interaction with Shieldred. You and target opponent each draw a card. If you do that with Shieldred on the battlefield, that means you gain life, your opponent loses 2 life. Feels good. Unholy Annex really wants a demon on the battlefield, and it combos with itself, right? You can pay 5 mana on Ritual Chamber and put a 6/6 black demon on the battlefield so you can start draining. But also remember, Soulstone Sanctuary is a demon, and it stays manned up after you man it up. It's not until end of turn. So it's important to understand if you need a demon on the battlefield, and all that stuff, Soulstone Sanctuary is maybe what you need. The first nuance is understanding how the cage, combo works. So Collector's Cage has Hideaway 5, which means they look at the top 5 cards of the library and they exile a card face down underneath Collector's Cage. And then Collector's Cage has an ability where you can pay 1 mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. And then pretty much your whole deck are not only things with different powers, but creatures that can create other creatures. So it's pretty easy to fulfill that condition on Collector's Cage. And so the big targets here are Overlord of the Mistmoors, being able to cheat that onto the battlefield turn 3 seems pretty solid, and Selesnya Gearhulk, Wiltleaf Liege, Sandstorm Salvager really good. There's a bunch of awesome targets that we essentially get to put on the battlefield for 1 mana, and then in addition, Collector's Cage is able to pump up our creatures as combat tricks because it's instant speed. Meaning we can do it during our opponent's turn, we can do it after our opponent's tapped out, we can do it to put an Overlord of the Mistmoors on the battlefield as a blocker, which makes it really hard to play around and makes it a priority for your opponent to make sure that you don't fulfill the requirements of Collector's Cage. Speaking of the Selesnya Gearhulk, Bright Glass, I think it's called, this deck has more recently shifted towards being sort of a toolbox deck with the Gearhulk, playing a bunch of cool 1-drops like these, so that when you put a Gearhulk on the battlefield, you're able to toolbox things that you need. Being aware of the toolbox targets, especially when you're playing it, so you know whether you should play the Gearhulk now because you really need a toolbox or something, or playing against it is pretty important. And then the last interesting play pattern / nuance you should probably know about is Parting Gust on your own creatures. Because understand, most cards in this deck have Enter the Battlefield effects. Most of the Enter the Battlefield effects create tokens. Something like Overlord or Break Glass Gearhulk, I guess that doesn't make a token, but you can search again. Parting Gust can get something out of the way, sure, so you can attack, but also the secret mode of it is bouncing something like Overlord of the Mistmoors and bringing it back, and that's even better in response to a removal spell, because then it's just a billion for 1, and you get the End of the Battlefield effects again. So let's start with the goal of the deck. Now, really what you're trying to do, the primary game plan, is jam in for 1 or 2 absolutely massive swings by playing a Tolarian Terror or 2, playing Crab on end step to tap something down, untapping, and then jamming for 10, 15, sometimes 20, between all the 5/5s you have and bouncing your opponent's creatures and things like that. This isn't really a nickel and dime deck, though we do have a nickel and dime game plan, in the Otter and Storm Chaser's talent. Which brings us to my other nuance and play patterns. Remember that there is a loop with This Town Ain't Big Enough and Storm Chaser's talent. It's pretty mana intensive, so it's only really good against decks that have already dealt with your primary game plan or you're going really, really long with. But Storm Chaser's talent makes an Otter. If you play This Town Ain't Big Enough to bounce Storm Chaser's talent or other stuff, or This Town Ain't Big Enough in the graveyard, cool. We can then level up Storm Chaser's talent to grab This Town Ain't Big Enough from the graveyard, and then cast This Town Ain't Big Enough again to return Storm Chaser's talent and either another thing of ours or a blocker. Replay Storm Chaser's talent, get an Otter. Level up Storm Chaser's talent, get the thing back. Play This Town Ain't Big Enough to return Storm Chaser's talent and reset it, etc., etc. This also profits additional cards if you have Up the Beanstalk on the battlefield, because it triggers every time you cast this town ain't big enough, even though it's only for 2 mana. And so it's a great way to get back into the game, and it's a great mana dump as well. I feel like it goes without saying, but some people don't know, Unsummon isn't just for your opponent's creatures. In fact, you're going to be using it more to protect your own creatures. You don't have that many threats. You just have the Otter, you just have Tolarian Terror, and you have Eddie Merc Crab. And Eddie Merc Crab is really easy to get rid of. So when you cast Unsummon, sometimes it's to get things out of the way, but very often it's to return your own creature back to your hand because it's so cheap. So you can replay it and effectively like negate a removal spell. Though, if you're doing something like that in Tolarian Terror, which by the way, you can do it with this town ain't big enough as well, make sure the ward trigger resolves first so that your opponent is forced to pay extra mana. Because if you just like unsummon your own creature, or this town ain't big enough your own creature in response to a removal spell, they just won't pay ward and they have that mana to do other things with. And lastly, remember that you can bounce your Eddie Merc Crab and then replay it to get the tap ability, especially since most of our bounce things, or actually all of them, are instant speed. So we can, like, on our opponent's end step, if we don't have a removal spell, we could, like, this tiny big enough our own crab, if we have 4 mana, and then replay the crab, tap something down, untap swing. It's pretty powerful. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.